Well, Brian Houston, thank you very much for your time. There's a lot that I'd like to cover in this interview, but I'd like to start first of all with your formative years, so your childhood back in New Zealand.
Sure.
You made a personal commitment to Jesus at the age of about 5,
Yes.
according to your book. And you say that for as long as you can remember, you always wanted to be a pastor. Do you remember how this desire formed, and what time or moment was it that the spark was lit in you, and sort of what was driving you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, obviously my parents were Salvation Army officers when I was born, and then they transitioned out of that and were just sitting in the Baptist church for about a year, and then took on a church in Auckland, which was an Assemblies of God church. And so in those days, my father used to go out into rural New Zealand and do crusades, like revival meetings, crusades. And so I remember that very, very specifically, it was in a tent in the north of New Zealand, and I remember going up the front and making that decision. Then really when I was 17, that was when I would say I really started developing a real relationship with God. But I grew up with this passion to serve Jesus. I think a lot of it then was my father's influence, and I admired him greatly and loved what he did. And I literally can't remember a time when I didn't just think one day, I want to preach, I want to be involved in ministry. I don't know I knew specifically that I'd pastor a church or what that would look like. But yeah, it's a funny thing. It's just been part of me as long as I can ever remember.
You've just had what I understand is called your Heart for the House weekend.
Yes.
This weekend just gone, where the church gets a real vision for what you're supporting as a church in missions and
Yes.
around the world and that sort of thing. So you're reaching out to people in our own city, and you've announced your 14th and 15th campuses in South America to
Yes.
be coming out this year. And you're reaching children and the needy all around the world, rescuing girls from slavery, and supporting a church in Iraq. So it's a global church now.
Yes.
How much further does your vision reach? Like when you reach this point, where to now? Like, do you have new ideas in your back pocket that you're waiting, just for the right time?
Funny, it's never worked like that. I've never had a master plan that we've worked to.
Yep.
Just been very intent about going forward, and I've always been a visionary. But even what cities we're going to, there's never been a master plan. It's really come down to the right person at the right place at the right time. And whenever we've got those three things right, it's gone well. It's been amazing. So, yeah, my goal is just keep on serving Jesus, keep building this church, and I find that when the time's right, God puts something into my heart or into the heart of those around me, and we make those decisions. But to me, it's a miracle story. An Australian church from the suburbs of Sydney, having the kind of influence God's given us is just miraculous, both through the worship and now through the church itself. And I mean, it's just amazing. Every Sunday night I walk into church and I look around, because it's generally very packed on Sunday nights. I look around and I get overwhelmed by the grace of God. It's amazing.
I'd like to talk about your book, which you've just published, Live, Love, Lead. I've had a look. It's a very personal book, almost like a memoir, and some really raw emotional stories in there. Why are you becoming such an open book these days with, I guess, the media and with your church as well, sharing so much of your life?
I don't think I've ever had any problem being authentic and being honest and transparent. I guess when you get a little older, you haven't got so much to lose. You've sort of built some credibility, and you kind of feel like, if it helps people, I'll tell my story. And that's my whole objective with Live, Love, Lead. It's definitely got a lot of my personal story and Hillsong Church story, but it's also got teaching content as well. And I felt like I needed to tell my story. I needed to, let people know some of the struggles that go along with the success.
Is it a book for pastors, or is there something in there for everyone?
No, it's definitely something in there for everyone, I think, yeah. I didn't really have pastors in mind when I wrote the book. I really had people in mind. I'm believing and hoping many non-Christians will get the book And of course, here in Australia, HarperCollins are publishing the book, and I think they fully intend to cross over with the book, being secular bookstores, etc., which is exciting for me.
Yeah, it's great. We've seen you in the media a lot in recent years, and I guess that's part and parcel of success or being in the public spotlight. How do you avoid being discouraged by constant media scrutiny and criticism?
I think I got better at handling it. When we built what is our Hills building, the big auditorium there, it's kind of like Hillsong came above the surface in Australia. We were known all around the world for our worship in Christian circles, but my next door neighbour wouldn't have known too much about who we were. And of course, that's all changed dramatically. And at first, when we started getting criticism, the unfairness of a lot of it, and the fear of what might happen, will people still come to church, was very real. These days, a lot of it's more water off a duck's back. I mean, I've got better at not allowing it to rule my spirit, but it's never pleasant. I think it's just so sad. Other countries around the world, we get such fair and generally very good media, including in the USA. But Australia, for whatever reason, I don't know whether it's the tall poppy syndrome or whether they just don't understand how a church in 2015 could be young and relevant and packed and growing when all of the statistics would say the church is supposed to be going backwards. But I find it always disappointing that the Australian media take the stance they take.
I'd like to talk briefly about your experience with your father and the story you share in your book of when you found out that he'd abused children while he was in ministry, and there were the pressures of the Royal Commission last year, and then your father passed away a few years after all of this came out, and I guess that you really lost a hero, not only your father. And you've said you've had some family fallout, lost contact with some siblings over all of that. How have you moved past the personal pain or moved through the personal pain of all of that journey?
Well, I feel like I really only have in very recent times moved on. At the time I went into leadership mode in terms of our movement, of which at the time I was the president, and of the church, obviously, including our city campus, where he was the pastor there for 22 years, and then with my own family, my own children, and so on. So I kind of looked after everyone else, but I don't think I looked after myself. And so in the book, I talk about really what was a 10 or 12-year decline. Our church was exploding outwardly, and our lives, Bobby's and my lives, were exploding outwardly, but I was imploding inwardly to the point where I got diagnosed as having post-traumatic stress. And so the fallout was very real. I feel just even being told that, knowing that, helped me, because I understood. I understood, okay, so this is real, and I've been able to bounce back amazingly. So even though it took a real big emotional toll, I feel like now I'm emotionally strong, and it's a good place to be.
Would you say that you ever suffered some depression through that time?
Well, I wasn't about to jump off a cliff, but yeah, I would say so. I would say definitely that I did go through years of depression.
What would you say to people who are going through a valley of mental illness of some kind, having had that experience? And I guess it's its own unique kind of valley in that the faith you need to overcome, by definition, it's hard to have that faith because of mental struggles. So what would you say to people that are in that sort of a valley?
I think the first thing is that people should never ever quickly just write off. Sometimes as believers we can sort of more or less tell people just to get over it, and life's not like that. It's not quite that easy, and I think just people knowing they're understood is a huge help, that you understand that you have compassion for them, you feel for them. And in the first half of my life, up to when I found out about my father, which is when I was 45, I was never that guy. I mean, if you had told me that one day I'd have a near burnout experience and go through periods of depression, I would have thought you were on drugs, because I just was never that person. I was happy-go-lucky, kind of took everything in my stride. Everything in those days of my life was great. And so I've learned also that no one should ever think it can't happen to them. And we've all got to look after our own inner well-being.
So in your book you recount a moment where your wife Bobby asks you, do you ever feel overwhelmed? And your response was, all of the time.
Yeah.
And I'm interested to know, what's it like and how do you deal with always feeling a little bit out of your depth?
I think it's good for us. I think it makes us depend on God. And I find in life, as I look back across my life, I don't feel I've ever been ready per se for any new step or anything new that we're moving towards. And so to me, it's really just a constant journey of faith. And I think ultimately that's what it comes down to. So I say, yeah, I do. Sometimes I find things a little overwhelming. We're heading up now to our Hillsong conference, and it's obviously very big. But again, I think I've got much, much better at not allowing myself to get too, involved in mood swings and so on. I have learned to be much better at just being confident and trusting God and looking straight ahead and doing what's next.
You've spoken about disappointment in some of your messages, and one thing that you said in one of your sermons at one point, you said, God uses your disappointment as his proving ground. What do you mean by that?
Disappointment, it's literally disappointment. So it's the antithesis or the opposite to appointment. And I believe that the whole point about disappointment is it's a destined, the spiritual power behind it. It's destined to get us off course with our God-given appointment. And so I feel like that it's really in those times, in those valleys, and those times of disappointment. If you talk about my father, apart from anything else, I was just fundamentally disappointed. But you come through those tests and you work out that that God is still God no matter what. And if you come through, well, you're going to be all the stronger for it. I don't think our proving ground's ever in our successes. I think it's always in the valley and in the challenge.
I also wanted to ask a question about regrets. Do you have any regrets? And if so, how do you deal with those? What do you do with those?
I regret writing a book called You Need More Money years ago. At the time, I thought it was a great idea to have a controversial title to a book. No one knew who I was really, and so I didn't have too much influence. But of course, it became like a bullseye on my forehead in terms of getting attacked. And a lot of what I wrote in the book I still would stand by, as in it really was about being a blessing. It wasn't about getting rich and piling up money. It was about being in a position to be a blessing. I remember one time a pastor was criticising my book, and then at the next breath was saying, well, you need a youth leader, but a youth pastor, we can't afford one. And so that was the whole thesis of the book. And so, but it was poorly written, and it was too easy to take it out of context. And obviously, now moving on and being a little more mature, I would have a far more seasoned attitude about that book. So that was a regret. But big picture, I don't live my life with regrets.
I'm interested to know about your personal devotion habits. So you talk publicly about the power of Jesus and that he's the centre of everything that you do and that we as Christians do. How does that look like for you in your own personal time at home, in your own devotion time? What's the structure, or I guess, what does your personal devotion time look like?
I've never been particularly structured at all when it comes to my time with God. I spend a lot of time on aeroplanes, and there's not a lot else to do on an aeroplane, so I find I have huge meditation, and some of the key direction I've received in life has actually literally happened on aeroplanes, where you're just away from people and questions and life, and you have the time. But the good news about where Bobby and I are at now is we've got such a great team around us that I have far more time to be just studying and meditating and spending time potentially writing and spending time in prayer, spending time with the Lord. And I love it. I find my love for the Word is greater than it's ever been. And my passion for learning, for really getting to know God's Word is stronger than it's ever been. But I've never been the kind who gets at 5 o'clock every single morning, spends an hour aside. What I do is I get up early in the morning and go straight to the local tuck shop and get myself a coffee, and I'll sit there, and between sort of looking at Instagram and so on, I'll spend a lot of time there just meditating as well. And
Sure.
yeah, I'm kind of person who, if I'm jogging, if I'm doing, I'm always better than if I just, would kneel down beside my bed sort of thing.
And sort of around that same area of inspiration, besides God's word, who or what inspires you?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot. It's hard for me to point to a particular person or mentor in my life these days. I've found over the years, God used different people at different times. As I said in Live, Love, Lead, in the early years of my life, right up to my midlife, my father was my hero and probably my greatest inspiration. But there's been other people along the way. But there's no particular person that I would point to. I just find that I'm nosy. I'm a reader of people and of life. And wherever I go, I don't feel like I go full of answers. I go full of questions. I always love learning. And you learn what to do and what not to do just by keeping your eyes open, I think.
I want to ask a couple of questions about the church and its position in society. You're aiming to lead a church that influences the culture, but also is culturally relevant and sensitive.
Yes.
So, and in Australia, we're now dealing with the issue of same-sex marriage, which is looking like it might be inevitable. How do you address issues like that as the leader of a church, and how should Christians deal with that?
I think it's very vexing and very challenging. The moment you get asked the question on secular media in particular, what do you think about homosexuality, or what do you think about gay marriage, you're going to lose people. You're either going to lose people on the one side, or you're going to lose your constituency on the other side. And if you say nothing, you lose everybody. And so it's one of those questions where there's just no great answer. I feel very much, I've described it like this, there's the word we live by, there's the world we live in, and there's the weight we live with. And the world we live in is obviously changing all the time. And as you said, gay marriages, perhaps, looking like it even may be inevitable. I mean, it's already legal in New Zealand and England and in 31 states of America, and many other places in the world. And I feel like, by the way, as Christians and as the Christian church, we can keep operating and keep living. I think the biggest challenge is if it was tried to inflict on churches what they do or don't have to do in terms of marrying people. But so there's the world we live in, which is changing. There's the weight we live with, which is the human toll, real people. People grow up in churches like ours and every other church in Australia struggling with their sexuality, whether we like it or not. And sadly, sometimes they've spoken to a youth leader perhaps, or even to their own parents, and felt this incredible rejection, and either spend the rest of their life hating God and hating the church, or even sadly, even more tragic than that, become suicidal because they feel hopeless. They're in a world that doesn't accept who they believe they are. So I very much feel the weight, the human weight of it. And of course, then there's the word we live by, and I think the word's very clear that that homosexuality is a sin. So yeah, I don't find it easy. I find it sad that you've got to try and basically write a whole lot of people off through one media statement.
With secularism, I guess, becoming more and more the norm in Australia and Western culture, how would you say that Christians can be the light in their community when it's probably becoming actually less and less popular to do that?
Yeah, it's amazing how it seems that everyone's so incredibly sensitive, politically correct about every other strata of society, including even other religions. And yet people in Australia sometimes see the Christian church as just open target. And it's just a very interesting thing. But I do feel still, in my experience with individuals, when I'm on aeroplanes, when I'm in airports, and even in shopping malls, people come up and they say, I watch you on TV. I'm not religious, but... And I find, in actual fact, that people are as spiritually hungry as they've ever been. And so I think if we realise that, and we just live with the kind of testimony where people can see what we preach working in our lives, that's the best thing we can do.
A question about how our understanding of God changes. As a young pastor, do you look back and see ways that you viewed God and ministry differently to how you see things now?
I grew up, in what you would call a classic Pentecostal church. And so that kind of really defined, I guess, I grew up believing that, you shouldn't be in movie theatres in case Jesus comes again, you're in the theatre. The world I grew up in, my sisters didn't wear jeans and you didn't buy ice creams on Sundays. And so it was a kind of a different world. I think in the earlier years of our church, somehow, I think just being inspired by other leaders and through travelling, I got a revelation of God that was just much bigger, broader. I think I got to know the heart of God a whole lot more, and really started to believe in a God who wants to bless people and build their lives. And it's amazing because, to be honest, it was out from that I feel like Hillsong Church really has become all that it has become. And I think it's framed my preaching, I think it's framed our ministry, I think it's framed the personality of our church. And I spent 12 years overseeing the Australian Christian churches, and I think it really had an impact on the movement as well, all out of really a revelation of God.
I'd like to finish with a couple of questions about, the legacy that you'd like to build and leave. You famously sat in your office in 1993, and you've talked about this in your book, where you wrote and journaled about the church that I see, and that's, you saw the international ministries and influence and TV ministry and that sort of thing. You sort of pictured that, and now that's a reality. What do you see another 20 years from now when you're 81 years old? What are you hoping your church will be?
I think the first part of a leader's life is very much, visionary, building, growing, and hopefully that never goes away. But I find the second part is more about equipping and empowering and releasing, and to a point letting go, trusting younger people. I've always tried to be very intentional about empowering younger people and believing in younger people and bringing them into, not just leadership in a youth group, but bringing them into the mainstream of our church, and it has really worked for us. I think my legacy, I feel like if I have an impact on people in a way that helps them fulfill their potential, that's what wires me. I just love seeing a young couple get their first house, a Christian build a business on kingdom principles and become prosperous business, and just seeing people in every walk of life fulfilling their potential. And so I hope my legacy is to build a church that is passed on to a younger generation that is strong, with the attitude that, let's believe by God's grace they'll make it even stronger. I've been talking a little bit right now about the song that the people sung, that Saul had slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands, and of course Saul got incredibly threatened, and the Bible says he eyed David from that moment on. I would love to think I could be the opposite, that by God's grace I had the chance to lead thousands, and now, hopefully through a little bit of my influence, those coming after me are leading their tens of thousands. I think that's the way to grow old gracefully in ministry.
I just wanted to get a picture of the kind of church that, let's say in 100 years' time, when his church historians look back, and we can look back now at pioneers like, say, Samuel Marsden and the Wesley brothers, and look at their passion and their influence that they had in their day, and how it's now grown into a denomination or that has a certain influence, yes, certain character in society. In 100 years' time, what would you hope can be seen and said about the Hillsong movement?
Well, I think in some ways we've had an impact on the way we do church, how people do church, not just in Australia, but all around the world. And it's funny, when I speak in conferences and so on, so often people say that. They would say that in some ways Hillsong has redefined the way that people do church, which is a great honour, because I've always believed that what we were called to do, including through our Hillsong conference, is to champion the cause of local churches everywhere. I'm a great believer in the church. I would love to go down as an advocate for the local church, because I just am a great believer in its potential, and its potential ultimately is to be a house which is family, community, that equips people to go out and be all that God's called them to be.
Well, Pastor Brian Houston, it's been an honour to speak to you.
Thanks
For
so
your
much.
time.
Appreciate it.